Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Jewish paranoia between Freud and Kissinger. While addressing a conference on anti-Semitism in Jerusalem in late January, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu returned to one of his popular themes. He calls it the World War Against the Jews, sometimes also referring to the theme as the World War Against the Jewish State. Netanyahu's choice of phraseology, World War Against the Jews, was heavily covered in the Jewish press, in the Hebrew press, and in, of course, the United States media. The theme developed by the Prime Minister is, in his own words, that, quote, they want to destroy the West as we know it, and they agree on one thing. What is the thing that they agree on? The World War Against the Jews. To conduct a world war, first against the Jews and against the Jewish state. He further explains that they are witnessing a nexus of the radical left and the Islamic extremists. He said, and for radical Muslims, they are right, because there would be no West in the Middle East if the Jewish state was eradicated. There would be no obstacle for further invasion of Europe if the Jewish state doesn't exist. And it also appeals to their internal hatred of the Jews, which has common roots with anti-Semitism over the centuries. That's a quote. A few days later, also in Jerusalem, this time at a meeting with a delegation of European parliamentarians, Netanyahu expounded upon his by now familiar to all theme and explained that, and I'm quoting here again, the Western Judeo-Christian civilization is under attack. This is an effort carried out not by radical Islam alone, but in collaboration with forces which you know well, the deep radical left and the Islamists, who, in theory, should be rivals, but are united by one thing, the hatred of Israel and the Jews. Bibi's correct. There are very strong factors in the world that are simultaneously uniting to destroy Jews and attack the foundations of Western society. There are people who brush off Netanyahu, people who tend to think that Jews and Israel have an obsession about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. People who believe and are convinced that Israel and lovers of Israel and Jews see a Jew hater and anti-Semitism behind every tree and look for an excuse, any excuse, to bring it up. They are, in many instances, correct. But then again, we are all familiar with the statement, often misattributed to Sigmund Freud, about how even paranoiacs have enemies. The phrases are, even paranoids have real enemies. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Although ideas developed by Freud are nowhere to be found in his actual writings, these pithy lines were probably the creation of a poet named Delmore Schwartz in the late 60s, and then very much popularized by U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. In a familiar vein, another expression popularized by Kissinger and touching on the same topics centers on Israel's Masada complex, the complex in which Jews see themselves as being perpetually attacked, surrounded by enemies, and about to be destroyed. The expression Masada complex emerges in the early 1970s. In 1973, the Hebraist and literary poet and critic Robert Alter wrote a now famous article in Commentary magazine with that title. Some say it was created, by the way, by Israeli essayist and historian Amos Elon. In the commentary piece, Alter notes that then Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir herself uses the phrase, and in further elaboration also said, we do have a Masada complex, we have a pogrom complex, we have a Hitler complex. It is obvious to historians, politicians, writers, and thinkers that a significant aspect of Jewish identity, and for that matter, Israel's identity, is one of persecution and survival. But that does not mean that the threats are not real. And today, there are more real threats than have been even in the past 8 decades since World War II. Attacks on Jews around the world are real. Threats made by Hamas and Hezbollah to destroy the Jewish state are real. And the danger of a nuclear Iran and its threat to Israel is real. very real. So Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke not only for himself, but also for the people whom he governs and represents, and the people whom he represents in speaking about the world war of the Jew means Jews around the world. Obviously, Israel has friends and allies, and of course, individual Jews have non-Jewish friends and partners, but it was appropriate phraseology spoken by the appropriate time by the appropriate person, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Jews around the world and in Israel harp on the dramatic rise in Jew hatred around the world because they are more than concerned. They are scared. The strange confluence of radical left Islamic and Islamic extremism that has forged partnership with groups that should be enemies is as confusing as it is frightening. They unite only over one item, one agenda item, and that agenda item is, of course, their joint hatred of Jews and the Jewish state. Jewish and Israeli paranoia is real. They do have enemies, real enemies, who are armed and ready to go to war to wipe them off the face of the earth. We have to remember that. Coming up, points of view. First up is a column from Ynet, published on February 1st, 2026, and is written by Doron Hadar. It's entitled, Iran's Missile Crisis and the Lesson from Cuba. Opinion: as President Trump confronts Iran, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis offers a revealing precedent. John F. Kennedy's mix of military pressure and restrained diplomacy may help explain the logic now shaping Washington's approach to Tehran. This is a very insightful column, drawing on history as well as power politics. This is how Doron Hadar begins. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted after the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was building a nuclear missile base in Cuba. U.S. President John F. Kennedy responded by imposing a naval blockade to prevent the base from becoming operational. The Soviets sent their ships toward the blockade in an effort to break it. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of a confrontation between nuclear superpowers, one that could have escalated into World War III. Kennedy had extensive consultations with professional advisors, chose his public statements carefully, and conducted negotiations with creativity and restraint. On the one hand, he enforced the naval blockade decisively and continued to build up forces. On the other, he sent clear signals of willingness to negotiate a resolution. Hadar now describes how the conflict was resolved. It was through negotiations and diplomacy. In the end, the crisis was resolved through understanding reached in negotiations. The Soviets withdrew their forces and dismantled the forward missile base in Cuba, while Americans quietly removed their nuclear missiles from Europe. That was in 1962. This is 2026. That was Cuba and the Soviets. This is Iran and the Ayatollah. So Hadar continues on this vein. U.S. President Donald Trump, who is now managing a crisis with the Iranian regime, faces a similar strategic choice. Is the objective to overthrow the Iranian regime or the removal of the threats emanating from it, namely halting the ballistic missile project and securing the transfer of hundreds of kilograms of enriched uranium still in Iran's possession? Around Iran, significant U.S. forces are now being deployed: aircraft carriers, special forces, and combat aircraft. Trump initially appeared inclined to support popular protests in Iran, hoping to help topple the regime and prevent mass bloodshed. However, following consultations with professional advisors and colleagues, he revised his position. He came to understand that regime change is neither simple nor quick and would require extensive effort and prolonged involvement. Hadar explains that what Trump is actually doing is different. Hadar is going to clearly lay out what Trump wants and provides us a logic and the strategy of Trump's moves. Hadar writes, as a result, it increasingly appears that Trump has opted for an alternative strategy, neutralizing the regime's threats, with an emphasis on the nuclear danger. Among Iranians who took to the streets and were killed in large numbers by the Revolutionary Guard forces voices of bitterness have begun to surface on social media. Some accuse Trump of betrayal. Hadar describes to us how the protesters in Iran feel abandoned by Trump. He writes, and this is a quote of a quote, "Trump promised again and again that he would shoot the man who shot me," one protester wrote. "Tens of thousands were killed waiting for help on the way that never arrived." Another wrote, "I lost my home and my father-in-law because I trusted him. Now my life is destroyed because of empty promises." Hadar explains what Trump is doing. He writes, "The purpose of Trump's current actions appear to be to apply pressure on the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. If rhetorical pressure combined with deployed forces does not suffice, Trump may order a demonstration strike designed to show seriousness and signal the regime to return to the negotiating table. The military buildup is also meant to prepare for an escalation that could follow such a strike, including the need for a sustained exchange of blows on both sides." Now Hadar again returns to 1962 and the comparison between this and the Cuban Missile Crisis to explain and make his final conclusions. He explains, "Operation Rising Lion lasted 12 days. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13. In a cycle of strikes develops, Trump is likely to aim for the short confrontation lasting no more than 2 weeks, followed by a return to negotiations. In 1962, Kennedy managed the crisis through a measured, incremental, and process-driven approach. President Trump, by contrast, is pursuing crisis management based on deterrence, pressure, and the pursuit of rapid achievements. Despite stark differences in the psychological profiles of Kennedy and Trump, both demonstrate an ability to make calculated decisions and willingness to pursue objectives without being dragged into all-out violent confrontation. A very astute analysis. Only time will tell if he is correct." Coming up next, a column also from Ynet. This piece is very disturbing, but it is essential. Academia and even medicine has been corrupted by Jew hatred. The column is entitled, "When Medical Journals Become Platforms for Political Messaging." The Lancet and Gaza, subtitled, "Opinion, Recent Gaza Coverage by the British medical journal The Lancet highlights a shift from scientific inquiry to moral advocacy, raising concerns about bias, editorial framing, and the erosion of academic neutrality in politically charged contexts." Radzik begins, "The recent exchange on the war in Gaza, published by The Lancet, one of the most prestigious and influential medical journals in the world, is less revealing for the conclusions it reaches than for the editorial logic it embodies. What is at stake is not simply a disagreement over data or terminology, but the broader question, what happens when a scientific journal no longer presents itself as a forum for inquiry, but as a platform for moral positioning?" This is a very important point, and it's important to point out, and he does a very good job. Lancet is one of the most critical medical journals in the world, and it's published, period, and they have dramatically swayed from their mission. Radzik writes, "The sequence is by now well known. On August 16, 2025, The Lancet published correspondence, breaking the selective silence on genocide in Gaza. The title itself, a departure from the usual conventions of scientific communication, a legally and historically contested term, genocide, is introduced not as a hypothesis to be examined, but as a premise that frames the entire discussion. The reader is not invited to evaluate the claim. It is asked to accept the vocabulary in which the claim is already embedded. This editorial choice matters. Scientific journals do not merely transmit information. They structure legitimacy. By selecting language, sources, and tone, they shape what counts as a reasonable question and what falls outside the boundaries of acceptable discourse." This is very important because this is a shocking reality. There was no discussion of the actual events, just actually discussion about the term genocide, which upsets the author Radzik also. He continues, the boundary was briefly reintroduced on January 24th, 2026, when the journal published Gaza, the Urgent Need for Rigor Over Rhetoric, a commentary regarding the previous article. Their intervention was modest in scope. It did not offer an alternative narrative, nor did it minimize civilian suffering. It simply asked whether the standards of terminology, source evaluation, and analytical distinction normally expected in medical literature was being upheld. The author is stunned, as am I, and says so. Radzik writes, in a journal committed to pluralism, this would have been the beginning of a methodological exchange. Instead, the author's reply, published in the same issue, marked a decisive editorial turn. Concerns raised were not treated as part of a legitimate scholarly debate, but reframed as genocidal denial. With that move, the discussion shifted from evidence to intent, from method to morality. This is a crucial meta-editorial moment. Once disagreement is recorded as ethical failure, the space for scientific inquiry effectively closes. The journal no longer curates a debate, it enforces a moral frame. Here Radzik, the author, explains the damage done by the editors. He writes, for Israeli readers, this sequence is significant, not because Israel is criticized. Criticism is neither new nor inherently problematic, but because Israel appears as the case in which editorial restraint is relaxed. The journal does not simply take a position. It naturalizes that position through the authority of medicine, transforming contested claims into quasi-clinical facts. The broader implication is uncomfortable. If scientific journals assume the role of moral adjudicators, their authority ceases to rest on openness and verification and begins to resemble that of advocacy institutions. The risk is not only bias, but a redefinition of what scientific legitimacy means. Radzik now concludes that science and medicine have actually been corrupted by this analysis. This is a very dangerous route to take, and he explains why. Israel in this context is not just the subject of the debate, it is the testing ground for a model of scientific communication in which editorial framing replaces inquiry. Moral certainty displaces analytical doubt. Whether this model will remain confined to Israel or extend to other conflicts and contexts remains an open question. What is clear is that when journals stop asking questions, science loses one of its defining virtues, the willingness to remain uncertain, especially when certainty is most politically convenient. This is an excellent and important column. Thank you. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I'm going to show you 7 cartoons today. First up is called Whack an Ayatollah. It's a play on whack-a-mole. Trump keeps whacking them, the Ayatollahs, and they keep popping up. It's a part of the game. The artist is telling us that hitting Iran is not having a significant impact. The second cartoon focuses on the same theme, just the exact opposite conclusion. The artist depicts Trump as tying up the Ayatollah with his infamous solid red tie. The cartoon is entitled Trump Ties Ayatollah's Fate, putting the squeeze on Iran, the opposite of Whack an Ayatollah. Third up is a cartoon from China, from the China Daily. It shows a clock and a countdown to war in the Middle East. The cartoon is entitled War is Near. It's by Lu Ji, published in the China Daily, as I mentioned earlier. Next up is a cartoon that depicts the beach in Gaza with skeletons. It's entitled Gaza Riviera, Trump Peace Board, Seaside Genocide. The cartoon is drawn by Ahmad Hajjaj, and it was published in the English paper Al-Arabi Al-Jadid in London. Next up is also a cartoon from the same paper, the same author, the same artist, published in London. It's called Gaza Map Multiplied, Nakba, Palestine, Israel War, by Ahmad Hajjaj and Al-Arabi Al-Jadid. It's a map of Israel dressed in the genocide or Holocaust uniform. It's very disturbing. This cartoon is called Ayatollah Scourge by Arned van Dam. It depicts the Ayatollah's whip being cut down by the masses. And finally, the seventh and last cartoon depicts the Ayatollah with a prison door and lock on his back. The obvious message is the Ayatollah is a war criminal and will be arrested, tried, and sent to prison. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Satellite images published in the Associated Press, the AP, show new activity at two nuclear sites in Iran that were bombed in June, Isfahan and Natanz. The images show roofs built over two damaged buildings, which according to the AP may indicate Tehran's attempt to hide efforts to recover materials left there or bombed there. This is the first significant activity visible by satellite at either of the sites. The roofs block satellite visibility of what is happening in Iran. The only way for the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, to monitor what's going on is through satellite imaging. The spokesman for Iran's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, Ibrahim Rezai, addressed tensions with the United States, saying, and I'm quoting here, "Any act of aggression against our people, our country, our interests will be met with response at the highest level, which will not be limited, even if the attack is limited. Our targets will not be restricted to American bases. All American interests fall within our range, and Israel will also be among our targets." He added, quoting again, "If the U.S. really cares about its soldiers, it should leave this region. Our forces are at their peak defensive and combat readiness, and our finger is on the trigger. Our current situation, our reserves, and our military and security capabilities far exceed what we had before the 12-day war." Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Larijani. This was reported by the Kremlin Russian media. We can only guess and surmise what they spoke about. In a conversation with reporters at the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump referred to the deadline he set for Iran, saying that, quote, "Only they know what it is, and I pass the message on to them," unquote. Regarding the vessels sailing towards Iran, he said, quoting again, "They need to sail somewhere, so they might as well do it near Iran. I stopped the execution of 837 people. Everything was ready, and I told them if they do it, they'll pay a price like no one has ever paid before. They canceled, and I appreciated that. We'll see what happens. They want a deal," unquote. Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman said in a private conversation in Washington that, I'll quote, "If the U.S. President Donald Trump does not follow through on his threats against Iran, the regime will strengthen," unquote. This was reported by the Axios website, citing 4 sources who were present in the room. Khalid is the younger brother of the Crown Prince and is visiting Washington for meetings on the subject. He met, among others, with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Keene, and Steve Witkoff, who was, of course, Trump's special envoy. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was visiting China and was asked if he would support an American attack on Iran. He replied, "The goal is to reach a situation where Iran cannot develop nuclear weapons, and that is the most important thing. We support the objective, and we are talking with our allies about ways to achieve this goal." South Africa has declared Israeli diplomat Ariel Seidman persona non grata. Seidman serves as the de facto ambassador since Israel's representative was recalled from South Africa in November 2023 amid diplomatic escalation between the two countries. That escalation is increasing now also. Israeli tennis player Guy Sasson won the wheelchair doubles tournament at the Australian Open Tennis Championship, together with his Dutch partner Niels Vink. They defeated British partners Andy Lapithorn and Australian Heath Davidson in a score of 6-1, 6-3. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at Micah at jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Ron Gvili's body was finally returned to Israel and to his family for proper burial. He was the last hostage. This was a momentous and transformational moment for Israel, for lovers of Israel, and for Jews world over. Let's watch these clips of how Israelis ended this horrific chapter.
After 2 long years in captivity, all hostages, both living and dead, are finally home.
They're home.
Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.